Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Perfect RIA podcast. I'm your co-host, Matthew Jarvis, and with me today, special guest Charlie Walker. Charlie, you and I are actually both scheduled to be on the agenda for the CISI conference in the UK in October, though our backgrounds are like wildly different. And so I'm really excited to have you on the show. I'm excited to be on the stage with you in October. But why don't you kick us off, Charlie, by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be on the agenda for a financial advisor conference?
Sure. Well, firstly, Matt, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here. So my name's Charlie. I've spent the last 15 or so years undertaking various expeditions, pretty much always by human-powered travel. So that is anything from walking, cycling, kayaking, canoeing, pack horse, ski, anything really. And usually the goal is to access remote places and get to know people, remote people, isolated peoples, and get to learn a little bit more about their lives. I've been doing this for about a decade and a half, and when I'm not off in the jungle or the desert or the tundra or the mountains, I'm back. I'm based in London, and between times I write books and give keynotes, which I'm excited to do at the same conference as you later this year. We do, as you said, have totally different backgrounds and life experiences. I suppose the reason we've ended up both talking, or will both be speaking at this same event, is that in very different ways, I guess we have experience in sort of trying to optimize time and experience and trying to draw on past challenges to maximize the future.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited, Charlie, to talk today and also to hear you speak in October. So I guess in a lot of ways you're living like a very, I guess we could say, non-conventional life, right? So plenty of people take their week or 2 weeks of vacation or holiday, and then they go to a resort and they take a cruise ship. Like you're doing the opposite. Like you're on, I don't call it holiday. Like you're adventuring all the time or a lot of time, and you're going it in ways, like you said, human powered, like the opposite of what everybody else is doing. What sort of inspired that? What are lessons you've learned from that? I mean, tell me, just like, help me see inside your mind here.
Well, it started in a relatively organic sense. I was always quite curious. I came from a very small village, and I think that possibly stoked my curiosity when I was growing up down in the southwest of England in a small sort of rural farming village. Even London seemed somehow quite sort of, impossibly exotic. So as soon as I got the chance, I started traveling whenever I could scrape together the means to do so. But quickly realized that for me, the places that particularly fascinated me were the places off the beaten track, the roads less traveled. So when I was in my early 20s, by which time I'd slowly kind of developed this ambition to be a travel writer, but more in the sort of adventure mold or exploration mold. I decided to just start big and set myself as big a challenge as I could possibly sort of conceive of, given the very small pool of resources that I had at that time. And that challenge was to cycle from Britain back to Britain via the furthest away place or furthest away point in each of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So that journey ended up taking 4.5 years. And I cycled almost twice the circumference of the planet in distance if you stretched out into a straight line. When I came back from that, I started writing, I started public speaking, and have never really looked back.
So let's just, I know you've been on a lot of adventures, but let's tackle that cycling one. So the furthest I've ever cycled was 210 miles in a day, which is not far enough to get to the corner of Africa by any means. But I would imagine like there wasn't like a tour group you could plug into, right? If you're saying, hey, I want to get from London to the end of Africa and back, to just pick one of the directions you went, did you hop on your bike and just start heading out? I mean, how did that come about?
Yeah, basically, well, firstly, 210 miles in a day, I think, is further than I've ever cycled in a day. So well done on that front.
Well, I didn't have to cycle the day after. You had to keep going. I can sprint for one day and I'm done.
Well, when I started, I don't think I'd ever cycled more than probably 60 miles in a day. I gave myself a bit of a baptism of fire, dived straight into the deep end. But to do something like that, you sort of do just have to start. There are so many different things that you could hypothetically try to prepare for, try to plan for, so many different obstacles, so many different things that could go wrong.
Yeah.
But if you get too bogged down thinking about all those things, then you're probably never going to start. There's actually a nice it's a phrase in English called the Doorstep mile. You may have heard of this. The Norwegians typically, predictably, have one word that sums it all up: Doorstokmil, which just means doorstep mile. But with the sort of precision of Germanic languages, the doorstep mile is that sort of that threshold, but it's more a psychological threshold than literally the first mile out of your door. So it doesn't necessarily mean it for a physical journey. For any undertaking, crossing that psychological threshold, starting, just getting going, getting the wheels in motion is usually the hardest thing and the best way to get moving. Once you start something, get the wheels turning, things will start to take care of themselves. You will encounter those problems, but once you gain a bit of momentum, be that literal or metaphorical, then you're likely to be better equipped and prepared to confront those problems as and when they arise. Also,
well, I love
you
that
said
concept.
that
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, you said that with a journey like that, one can't just join a tour group, particularly not when you've got a budget of, I think I had about £2.50 a day to live off, which maps onto about $3.50 per day for years. So it was very much living in a tent, sleeping rough, wild, wherever I could, cooking, whatever food I could get hold of cheaply on the side of the road on a stove, sat in my tent, very much a sort of feral existence for a long span of time.
I love this idea of the doorstep mile, right? That's that first step. And I suppose, and I'd love your insights on this a little bit more specific to this trip or your other ones, right? I would imagine you came across so many things that you couldn't have even planned for, or the things that you did plan for turned out to be totally different, right? So we seem to sit and think, I've got to plan this totally out. I've got to have all the resources. I've got to have everything mapped out. A, we'll never get it all mapped out. And B, half the things we map out don't turn out to be accurate anyway.
Yeah, I mean that was the case in this for this journey in a lot of different ways. I mean, for one, just on a sort of political or geopolitical level, the Arab Spring happened after I set off, probably 9 months in, and
oh, wow.
As a result of that, my sort of vaguely anticipated route through the Middle East changed quite a lot a couple of years on. Of course, that was no big issue for me, and there were much bigger things at stake and at play,
of course.
During that time. I suppose other problems along the way, when I was in the Congo, thankfully with a friend at that point, 95% of the journey I was by myself, but for this stint through the Congo, the road I was following just stopped essentially. So we bought a pirogue, a dugout canoe, and spent the following month paddling, about 500 miles down a river that had rapids and waterfalls and hippos and crocodiles and just every sort of, problem imaginable. And, things like that you can't really plan for or prepare for.
No.
And it's best probably just to, with caution, give it a go and see what happens. That said, a lot of people would argue that I'm lucky not to have died on a number of occasions during this journey and others subsequently. So I suppose I always like to point out that I'm never advocating that anyone goes and does exactly what I do for a living. It's kind of a personal choice, but I suppose the lessons can be extracted and applied to other aspects of life.
Charlie, any thoughts on smaller steps? So it seems like that getting over the doorstep mile is a muscle that can be learned, right? I would imagine now you're doing, like you said, for a decade and a half, you've been doing these adventures, and you wouldn't necessarily recommend that someone start today and bicycle from their house to the tip of Africa. Recommendations on smaller steps that we could each take to say, well, let me test this doorstep mile. Like, what's a smaller adventure that you would recommend someone start on?
Well, I mean, firstly, if someone was just eager to go and cycle to the bottom of Africa, I would say go for it. But that's only if they wanted to do that. Ways to start smaller is, I'm not the best example of this, I suppose, because I pretty much did just dive straight in and didn't particularly build up with what I was doing. But I have seen a lot of other people do so, and it can be steps just as small as changing your routine, throwing a bit of uncertainty into your day-to-day life, because then everything becomes a bit more of an adventure. And I suppose the the biggest sort of tool in my toolkit on these journeys is being able to on a sometimes a daily basis deal with the unexpected and to not let that throw me off my stride. And the more that you throw those unknown sort of little bombs into your life, the more you'll get used to pivoting. The more it's just like stress testing. The more you stress test, the more you stretch yourself. You'll never quite return to exactly the same shape, like a bit of elastic. You slightly pass your elastic limit and you're left altered and hopefully stronger, although that that analogy doesn't carry with elastic.
That's true. How do you, or thoughts on balancing? So you mentioned you're doing adventures kind of throughout the year, and then you're taking time, you're speaking at this conference. For those watching online, you can see that you live in a home, right? There's books behind you. You seem like you didn't join us from the side of a bicycle trail with internet that you borrowed. So you're somehow balancing some amount of what I'll call like a traditional lifestyle with these grand adventures. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's sort of an ever shifting balance for me. When I was throughout my 20s, really, the balance swung much more towards spending as much time as was physically possible out, doing the physical adventurous things I love. But of course, that doesn't particularly sustain or build a lifestyle that's going to be, more sort of sustainable and a better way to prepare for the future. So now, the balance is nice. Maybe between a quarter and a third of each year, I'll be off out somewhere doing something. Next month, I'll be heading off to Papua New Guinea for a few weeks to hike through some jungle and climb some mountains. But in the meantime, today I've been sat at my desk all day writing a book about a hike through Siberia last year. Wow. Actually, a word to the wise: if you're trying to write a book, don't do what I did today, which is to leave the cricket on over the radio while writing the cricket commentary. This summer is an Ashes summer. So in the UK, we've got Australia playing England at cricket in England for 25 whole days.
Oh, wow.
And we are in day 2 of the 5-day test or match. And I've had the cricket on all day. So my word count has probably been slightly reduced by that fact, but I don't regret it.
That's just fascinating. And so to kind of sustain your adventures, you're doing writing, you're doing speaking, you're writing books. But I would imagine, and I don't need to get into your personal finances here, like you still are, it's not as though like you're wildly sponsored and Red Bull is sponsoring your adventures. I mean, you're being very intentional about how you're spending your time and your money.
Mm. Yeah, well, for one, I've never had particularly sort of lavish tastes, and the journeys, I suppose, living frugally on a bicycle probably, if it didn't create that aspect within me, it certainly consolidated it. But I've always undertaken journeys that are pretty low-fi, low-cost, although nowadays I tend not to put nowadays I don't put personal resources into them. They are supported or sponsored in various different manners. But I would be lying if I said I had if I had a pension, particularly early in life. That's something that has come around a little bit later for me. But I've always loved writing and have focused on writing. And the 2 books I've written so far, I'm immensely proud of and have had, thankfully, very positive feedback from them. And actually, it seems to be semi-regular now. I get a message from someone saying, "Hey, I read your book, and now I've not that I encourage this. I've sold my house, and I'm off on a journey, and I'm heading off around the world." So hopefully, those are having some sort of effect, varied effects, not always exactly that, selling up shop and leaving. And speaking is something that I'd never really anticipated being a revenue stream, but it's something that seemed to come to me relatively naturally, and again started quite organically. People just started asking me to come and give talks at village halls or schools or the odd business here and there. And gradually that grew into a nice, sustainable business with a lot of repeat custom. So it's been, that's been, I guess a stroke of luck on that front.
Luck, as they say, luck favors the prepared. Tell us a little bit about your 2 books. What are the titles of the books? And then tell us a little bit about those.
Well, those two books together tell the story of that 4.5 year bicycle journey. The first book is called Through Sand and Snow, which is sort of
Okay.
a bit of a coming of age or rite of passage story. It's about setting out age 22 into the big bad world and, sort of just getting stuck into things. The second book picks up where that one leaves off, although they're sort of both are standalone books. They needn't be read in order, or they could
Sure.
just be read independently. And that second book is called On Roads the Echo, and that continues the narrative through Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, the Congo, long stint through Iran. So they together are quite a long story, but they're out on audioback and Kindle. They can be found online in bookshops, etc. So do look out for them if anyone's interested.
Yeah, of course. No, I'm excited to add both of those. As you talk about your travels, you mentioned traveling through Iran, you mentioned traveling through Africa, through the Middle East, all of these places. Obviously, you've been to a lot of places that are off the beaten path, right? You didn't mention, though I'm sure you've been, places like Paris or places that are really tourist attractions. Are there spots that come to mind where you think, boy, I really wish people could see this? Like, I really wish more people would get off the beaten path and see this thing or the other, at the risk of it now becoming a tourist attraction.
Absolutely, definitely. And I mean, I've not been to many of the places that many people expect one to have gone to. I was briefly in Paris a couple of weeks ago for an afternoon for work, and that was
Sure.
the first time I'd been there. So, I'm not so, I mean, I've been to
Interesting,
Timbuktu, but
yeah.
not really, the great capitals of Europe. Well, you picked up on Iran. Iran is somewhere,
Yeah.
and I recognize that it is firstly going through a period of turmoil and hopefully change. Time
Yeah.
will tell on that front. And I also appreciate that it's different for different nationalities to visit
Of
there.
course. Yeah.
For particularly Americans, but also Brits, it has complications. Although I mean, I've done the odd bit of work there many years ago as a tour guide. I've taken American tourists to Iran without problem. I remember
Sure.
at one protest. This won't necessarily sell the country to many of your listeners, but there was a protest. There were thousands of students marching down the street, and it was the anniversary, if I remember correctly, of the storming the siege of the American embassy, and there were lots of
Oh,
placards.
yeah.
Anti-America placards.
Sure. Sure.
Some of them said in Farsi, "Death to America."
Sure.
And yet the people carrying those placards chatted happily and in an incredibly friendly and welcoming way with me and the guests, some of whom were American and openly so. So it's a country of complicated contradictions, and it is actually hands down the friendliest place I've ever been. I've been to a lot of
Interesting.
countries over the years,
Yeah.
and nowhere really comes close to that. I mean, besides Iran, there's nowhere I wouldn't recommend people visiting. I just think the world is an incredibly varied place, and you're never going to have an unenriching experience if you go to another country. Not everything is going to be necessarily champagne and fun and jet skis, but you are always going to learn something. You are always going to meet people who will leave a mark on you, and that's always a good thing.
Yeah, I've always found it super enlightening. I've traveled a little bit, obviously nothing compared to yours, but it was fascinating. We spent 3 weeks with the family backpacking through China one time, and it was so fascinating to escape the Western world, right? So obviously there's differences between the United States and Canada and the UK and Europe and whatnot, but it's still very much the Western world, right? There's still a McDonald's or a Starbucks, but to go to parts of the world, and you've been to most corners of it, where it's not the same as what you've seen before is so enlightening. Charlie, additional thoughts on getting over that first step, the doorstep mile. I talk to financial planners, that's who listens to our podcast, to them, to their clients, and a lot of times we end up stuck staring at that doorstep mile. You just flew over, right? You went in head first. As you've seen other people or people have reached out to you, what has helped them take that first step over the doorstep mile?
I think the key point is to just set defined parameters for whatever it is that you're trying to work towards, and key amongst that is a start point. Let's stick with the example of a journey. I mean, every undertaking is a journey in one manner or other, but if you set your date on which to start and you tell people about it, let's say you're starting a business, let's say you're setting up a fund, whatever it might be, tell people about it, and then you will have people to hold you in some sense accountable to yourself. And telling people about it is probably the best way to hold yourself accountable personally, because I think for most people, particularly for people who are keen to do things, the doers out there, they are people who will have, a sense of commitment once they've said they're going to do something, because the idea of backing down and not doing something in front of other people is, well, frankly, terrifying to a lot of people like me, not least. I think setting a start time and then starting at that time is this all relates back to that doorstep mile. That for me is one of the most important things. If you keep your plans secret, then they can stay secret and they may never see the light of day. And that's probably a tragedy.
Yeah, it really is, right? It sort of becomes this bucket list that's never achieved, right? Like someday I'll do this, but someday never becomes. It almost seems, I'd be curious your thought, Charlie, if people have journeys or adventures, whether it's, to your point, starting a business or traveling the world or something like that, that they almost go back through that bucket list and assign a date to each one of those, right? I'm going to do this one in October
someday
of 2023.
is not in the calendar.
Yes. Well, that's a good one. I like that. Someday is not on the calendar. Yeah, but to go back through, and that's something I'm actually going to start doing with clients, right? See what I know things are on their bucket list. They've said, hey, I've always wanted to see the pyramids of Egypt or whatever the case may be. To go back through and put a year on those, great. What year are we going to do that? And I loved your point about, Charlie, just tell everyone, if only because it's going to hold you accountable. Maybe if you're not accountable to yourself, at least you'll be afraid to welch on the bet with your friends. Exactly.
And that maybe isn't the most healthy instinct, to basically sort of guilt yourself into doing something, but it's extremely effective.
Oh, I love that. Well, Charlie, this is fascinating. So you mentioned your next adventure, as of the date we're recording this, you're heading into the jungle. Tell us just a little bit about that, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of action items for our listeners.
Well, it's actually a relatively short journey this time around. It's my third visit to Papua New Guinea, which is one of the most bizarre, otherworldly and fascinating countries I've ever been.
Really?
I'm there for about 6 weeks. I am aiming to climb an unsummited mountain, along with some people who live in the area. But essentially, I'll be heading to the end of the road, hiking off into the jungle, and then just walking village to village, community to community, deeper into the mountains, into the jungle, and just spending time with people, getting to know about their lives. I mean, this is a part of the world that very few people go to. This is a part of that country that very few people travel in and out of. It's a country where, thankfully, this finished 50 years ago, but just 5 decades ago, cannibalism was commonplace. It's a country that was, vast areas of it were still in the Stone Age just 100 years ago. So there's been a tremendous sort of not clash, but meeting of civilizations there, and an acceleration through from the Stone Age to the mobile telecommunications age. So it's just a really, really interesting place to sort of visit as a, I suppose, kind of hobbyist anthropologist.
I love this idea that for you, a shorter adventure is 6 weeks. Like I love when we all have these like preconceived notions of time, right? I'm going to go take a vacation of 1 week. You say, oh, this is a shorter one. It's just 6 weeks. And I'm going to go to the end of the road and see where it goes past the end of the road.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing. Well, Charlie, this was a fascinating discussion. I look forward to seeing October. Action items for our listeners. Go ahead and check out Charlie's books. There was Through Sand and Snow and On Roads That Echo. And then you said you're working on yet another book, so we'll be excited to see that one come out when that one comes out as well. And then for all of our financial planners, our listeners in the UK, Charlie, you and I will be at the CISI conference the first week of October, which will be a lot of fun.
Correct. Yeah.
Charlie, any other parting words of wisdom to our listeners, or just people in general based on your adventures?
Well, I suppose I would say work out what your doorstep mile is, whatever that is, and then walk it. Do it. And the second is turn off the cricket when you're writing, because it will not help.
It's funny, Charlie, this is a translation thing. Here in the States, there is a home hobby device that's called a cricket, and it prints like labels, like stickers. And so when you said that the cricket was going, I thought, he's got a label maker going on? What's going on over there? That's
Having a small speaker in the office is one of the worst things.
That's awesome. Charlie, thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to reading your books, and to all of our listeners, until next time, happy planning.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Charlie.